Well, Peter, it's a great privilege after all these years to be talking to you about your life and work. And I thought that perhaps we could start by asking you when you were born.
1924.
1924. Can you tell us anything about, or tell me anything about your parents and your background, your early life?
Yes, because I think it is significant in relation to anthropology, and being slow-witted, I only realised this quite recently. I was brought up in Merseyside, which is rigidly divided then between Catholic and Protestant. And also my parents were, my father was a very small businessman. He was an auctioneer and then an estate agent. And we lived in a lower middle class part of the Wirral. And I was always but his work, his sale rooms, auction rooms, were in Birkenhead, which is extremely poverty-stricken, depressed and proletarian in those days, and oscillating between petty bourgeois Wallasey and proletarian Birkenhead. I was very vividly struck with the contrast of the misery of the people in Birkenhead. I remember, as everyone remembers, blind men with notices saying blinded at the Somme and their medals on, selling matches in the street. I mean, it's the classic Orwell kind of syndrome. And that, I think, gave me a sense of injustice and of the inequalities in the world. And what I didn't, then I went to a Catholic school, St. Francis Xavier's in Liverpool, but...
Were your parents Catholic?
No, they were mixed. My mother was of Protestant descent, but in those days you had to change at marriage. The Catholic Church would not accept a marriage. So she switched nominally to a Catholic faith and had to go through a period of indoctrination, but retained, of course, some resistances in her mind. And after a while, I was very unhappy at SFX. If you ever read Joyce's Portrait of the Artist, you will know about their discipline. Can I give a couple of instances? Well, they're very authoritarian. The punishment for the most trivial offence, like being late, was very, not always, but very often, to be struck on the hand with a whalebone ferrule, as it was called. Extremely painful. You might get 6 of those. The Jesuits, however, are very clever people, and they've invented some exquisite ways of dealing with morality. If you did good work, you would get a thing which was on a piece of red parchment-like paper, inscribed in Latin ad majorem Dei gloria, and it had a value, say 6 or 10 or 12 in the corner. And the idea was that you'd stored up merit in heaven. And if you were then to be punished for some terrible offence like being late, you could trade in the merit you'd stored up in heaven. Now, I regarded that, even as a young child, as extremely immoral, because I thought if you're going to be punished, then you should be punished, no matter how much one disliked the punishment. But the Jesuits had a special twist. You would trade in your red bill, and they would refuse it. Or, you never knew. It was absolute moral indeterminacy. And I think that was utterly disgusting. Didn't like the Jesuits, didn't like brutality, authoritarianism, and moral indeterminacy. And I think that may have made me unhappy, sometimes like physically ill. And my mother used to protect me by giving me sick notes all the time. Eventually took me away from the school, and I went to a marvellous Protestant, liberal, the classic case of a kind of Mr. Chips headmaster. Wonderful teachers who taught me history and English and told me why the First World War started and all kinds of stimulating things. But the process, you see, it meant that I was very much aware of a world which is parcelled between 2 different cultures. And when I began to Wallasey Grammar School, this lovely school, I eventually became head boy. But being a Catholic, I wasn't allowed to attend the morning services, though I was head boy. And we used to go into a small room at the side with the Jewish boys and do our homework and tell dirty stories. And what else do boys do? So I was always very conscious of democracy and inequality, but also not just in democracy in terms of the rights of the majority, but of democracy in terms of the rights of minorities, because I was one of them. And I didn't realise this. That affected my formation until years later. And I think that's what makes me, probably, surely, sensitise me to other cultures, minority cultures, and people who are not like us.
Yes, I was thinking this is a classic upbringing for an anthropologist who feels between 2 different cultures. So you at the end of your school, you then decided to go to university, or?
Yes, and I did what I suppose most people still do. I had these very inspiring masters in English and in history. And having moved from a Catholic school, when I changed over, I discovered that I was 3 years behind in mathematics and 3 years ahead in Latin. So that ruined me for a science career, natural sciences. So I inevitably went on the humanities track and did very well at it. And so I went up to Cambridge and read English. So I followed what I was well trained at. I was a Leavisite.
Were you?
Yes.
This was just before the Second World War.
It was 1942.
When
I went there, yes, in Stalingrad. And that was the next crucial influence, of course.
But the fact that you read English, it's noticeable in your work that you place a lot of emphasis on literature and are interested in literature, and that was partly imbued through reading English at that time.
I'm sure so, yes. And of course, Leavisite English literature, English literary criticism was extremely social.
Mm.
Though it's elitist and all kinds of other negative dimensions to it, but I was strongly influenced by that. And
also by Eliot, or not?
And by Eliot, yes, and by Lawrence, and by Thompson, and the whole school of, we might call it social literary criticism, that eventually flowered in Raymond Williams, I guess.
Mm. And then Stalingrad. What?
Then Stalingrad. Well, anyone who has a heart, as they say, was interested in the world in 1942, when all that stood between us and the concentration camps was the Red Army.
Is that how it felt?
Certainly.
Mm.
Churchill said as much.
Mm.
And he was right. It certainly felt like that. So it wasn't very long before I was in the Communist Party at Cambridge.
Was this, Cambridge is, perhaps I shouldn't ask, but at that time, or perhaps a bit early, it was notorious that many people joined the Communist Party, and many of them indirectly and subversively, well, not subversively, but
they became spies.
Secretly, yes.
Yeah, no, there's a completely different generation. Never knew any of those people, never had anything to do with them. They'd passed on and were in the higher establishment of the scientific service by then, I suppose, and Foreign Office. No, we were a lot of young people just come up, a surge of both of anti-fascist enthusiasm, commitment, and it's very difficult to realise now, but at that time it was extremely respectable, patriotic even, and I saw a film the other day of Lord Beaverbrook, I think, making the most positive statements about Stalin at the height of the war. And so it was a natural graduation. And then I went off from Cambridge into the army, and being a child of the elite by that time, if you'd taken your certificate A and certificate B in the, what was it called? It wasn't called the OTC, but it was the equivalent. Cadet Training Corps.
Combined Cadet Force.
We used to do a few weeks in the vacations. I got out of my second one and I went and worked in Pi's radio factory instead, making things for the war effort. But that meant automatic entry straight away into officer training school, officer cadet training school. And I went to Llandudno Wells and became a Royal Artillery officer. Bloody tough it was. From Cambridge, surrounded by guys who were almost old enough not to be my father, but who had experienced several years of war. And were in their 30s and had children and families, and I was a young whippersnapper from Cambridge going straight in to be an officer. I got into trouble because I had never been on guard duty. And I was put on guard duty one night. I did the wrong thing, and I was hauled up for the colonel, and I said, I'm sorry, it's the first guard duty. He said, okay, I understand, but don't do it again, because I was so wet behind the ears. Then I went into the anti-aircraft around various parts of Britain. It was the time of Alamein. I didn't need, the blitzes were over. We'd experienced all that as children in Liverpool. Blitzes were over, so they didn't need anti-aircraft, but they wanted men to die as infantry. So we were converted into infantry lieutenants. And in the middle of that process of conversion, they asked for volunteers to go to East Africa or to West Africa. I didn't know anything about either, so I think I flipped a coin and chose East Africa. Thought it would be somewhat interesting and exotic. And I went out there and it was marvellous. It was a very good war out there. The fighting was over.
You describe one experience when you first arrived outside Europe, when you arrived in Cairo, I think it was, seeing a man nursing something which looked like a football.
Yes.
That was a shock. I mean, that wasn't marvellous.
Terrible. Oh no. Egypt was a revolting experience. The degree of poverty and was something mind-blowing. And when people talk about racism in Britain, which I've always believed ever since those days, is extremely deeply entrenched in the British population, one of the major sources of it was the direct experience of many, many hundreds of thousands of British troops, both in the First World War and in the Second World War, apart from the Indian and other armies, who experienced at first hand two places in particular, Egypt and India, both exceedingly poverty-stricken. And the response of most of the British troops is to say that this condition is due to their indolence, stupidity, lack of Puritan ethic, all kinds of blaming the victim. They go home and they communicate that to all their families, kin, networks and so forth, and it becomes, I think, a fundamental source of the deep-rooted racism in Britain. Many generations of it. The imperial experience.
And you had that shock too when you arrived.
Yes, but I was a red, you see. I was intellectually protected against that kind of thing. Otherwise, I suppose I might have absorbed it too. I remember when I went to India eventually, I actually made contact with the Indian Communist Party, and there's a large unrecorded history of that, because people like John Saville, my dear friend, and many others, Clive Branson, made those connections with India. John Saville took leave as a regimental sergeant major at the end of the war, took his 6 months leave in India and worked for the Indian Communist Party. Things went on like that, you know. Men going up to the front at Anzio told me that they used to walk up and down the train with hundreds of copies of the Daily Worker, selling them to the troops. Then there was the Cairo Forces Parliament, you know about that?
Yeah.
Well, part of the war effort was to inculcate a spirit of democracy and political education in the troops. And there was an elaborate, what's called ABCA, Army Bureau of Current Affairs, which promoted political discussion in the army. And as a kind of spin-off of that, I wasn't directly involved in it, but there was an elected forces parliament in Cairo. And I've forgotten the exact proportions, but we can put it backwards and say Conservative was about 10%, Labour was something about 60%, Communist was about 25%, and the rest. And that was the mood of the troops at that time. So that was a reddening experience, and after that I went out to India with I went to East Africa. Now that introduced me to Black Africa, and I was entranced. We learned Swahili on the boat going out.
Yes, I noticed you have a whole lot of Swahili dictionaries
from then.
in that period.
Well, the first few weeks we were there, we went to Jean's school, near Nairobi, and I think it was a few weeks course.
Jean LaFontaine?
No, it's called after some missionary pioneer, I think. It was the elite school like Achimota, for sons of chiefs and other high Africans. But it was converted into a wartime place where officers were taught Swahili, and I did very well. I got something like 90% and got my lower standard Swahili examination within 2 or 3 weeks, I think.
Goodness.
And but I got interested in African languages and African culture. I realised there was an African culture, and I used to see these Kikuyu villages round about. We weren't even allowed to go in there very much, and of course all African urban areas were off limits to troops. You would be arrested. But I got to know the African troops, and I even learned a bit of Luo, mainly through language, because one couldn't study anything about their background. They were army soldiers. And I went out with them to India, to Orissa, Ranchi, and we were due to go into Malaysia, as it is now, Malaya, about 7 days after the war was actually terminated, and we would have been butchered. We were supposed to go onto these beaches in Malaya where the Japanese were sitting with machine guns and artillery all around the heights. We were to walk up the beaches. But one night, as I came back into the camp, I heard a tremendous noise of Africans drumming. Dum, 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 dum. So I said, what the devil's going on? And they said, haven't you heard? They said, the war's over. So I first heard it from the jungle drums.
That's
marvellous. And then then I had this lovely job. I decided to enjoy the war after that. We went back to East Africa, and I had a lovely job taking African troops back to their natal villages, demobilization, and we went to very remote parts of Tanzania, Sudan, Uganda, and so forth, which is great fun and very interesting, and I saw a lot of village life. And so I determined to become an anthropologist by this time.
You'd heard of anthropology, had you?
I read a lot in the army. I bought books in Nairobi. I read Peristiani, for example, on the Kipsigis, Hollis on the Nandi and Maasai. Anything I could lay my hands on, which wasn't very easy, and there weren't many books in those days.
How had you heard about it at all? Because
anthropology?
I mean,
we would just go into the bookshops and look up the sections on Africa.
I see.
Missionary bookshops there mainly were. And I read everything. I read Biesheuvel on African intelligence, and I really became hooked on anthropology. So when I went back, I said to my tutor, Emmanuel, I wanted to change courses, and he groaned and said, "Oh my God, you ex-servicemen," he said, 90% of you have changed your courses. Which shows, I think, that people just drift into the wrong thing at the beginning. Or there's a series of successive influences which direct one. So I switched over. As a matter of fact, that's not quite correct. I said I didn't think that they would tolerate my doing anthropology, which is what I really wanted to do. So I said I wanted to do sociology. He said, "We don't have it in Cambridge." I said, "Oh, thank God, can I do anthropology instead?" So I got what I wanted. But people are now dead, so one can say it. Anthropology at that time was in a shocking state.
In Cambridge, or generally?
Generally. Professor Hutton was the professor. He wrote interesting books on caste, as you will know, and about the Nagas. I remember most of us convinced that most of anthropology was about soul stuff. That if you cut off people's heads, you gain the potency, which you can then direct to your own ends. Hutton would go on about this for hours on end. We also had utterly appalling courses on material culture, which were risible, hilariously funny.
Who by? By Hutton?
No, by
Gwilym Jones?
no, he didn't do them. Oh dear.
Jack
The man who
Shepherd.
ran the museum, Bushnell, did some of them. Yes.
Why were they
Nice
so...
chaps. Oh, well, we used to do practicals and fire drills. And we nearly set the place on fire once, I remember. Frank Girling or somebody at the back caused an actual fire.
You mean fire drills as with...
We used the, oh yes, it was practical course, it wasn't just abstract.
Not fire
theory.
drill as in rushing
No,
into a building.
drills that make fire.
Yes.
And then Bushnell used to take us out into the courtyard where the anthropology building is, and into the museum, and we would practice with blowpipes, so it was very dangerous. And with Australian spear throwers. I remember throwing one right over the building. It landed amongst all the cyclists in Downing Street. And very dangerous course.
Did you learn the Mongolian bow release? This was what Jack always used to tell us
bow
about.
release. And Godfrey Leonhardt, it was our examiner of the material culture, I remember. It was extremely funny because he thought it was a stupid course, and so did we, but he couldn't say so. And none of us were interested, very highly motivated, and he kept giving us quite illicit clues, and he used this huge, heavy spear. He said, "What do you think it could possibly be used for?" I said, "Well, you can't throw it, it's too big." No, he said, "It would probably be dropped from a tree, wouldn't it?" I said, "Yes." "I can't imagine on what." And he said, "Well, what kind of animal?" And he was leading us all the time to the correct answer, which was a hippo-killing spear that you drop from a tree in Uganda. Well, we had that. Material culture, we had physical anthropology, of course. And of course archaeology, which I found very interesting. But now I'm totally British in my attitude. I always alienate my American friends who believe in the four disciplines: physical, linguistics, archaeology, and social and cultural anthropology. I don't. We had to do all the physical stuff, which is of course interesting. But I regard it fundamentally as irrelevant. I'd much rather do something like history or whatever, some social science. And so much of it was a diseducation. And as for anthropological studies, proper social anthropology, I found some very interesting books. It was rather like as if one had discovered a hoard of dirty books, because they were hidden behind an iron grill in the professor's private suite. Professor Hutton, and I said I wanted to read these books from the Rhodes Livingston Institute by Max Gluckman. Could I please take them out? And he allowed me to. You had to get special permission. We called it modern anthropology. We didn't know, as against what we were taught. Now Hutton, for example, used to give a course on, I think it's called theory or something like that. And I remember him dealing with Freud. And he had a very strange mannerism, like that every few minutes. And he said, Freud. He said, well, there are many single-stranded theories. I mean, Freud's view is that human behavior is largely motivated by sex. Damn nonsense, he said. Who's ever heard of anyone making love when they're seasick? And there was a sort of level of the course. Well, eventually we heard one day that a modern anthropologist had been appointed to the staff, and we were thrilled, called Ray of Fortune. And he was a breath of fresh air, though Rayo was a most bizarre fellow too. He started his first course, and he said, physical anthropology, and had a mixture of a New Zealand and American accent. Physical anthropology and social anthropology, what's the relationship between them? He says, well, in the Chin Hills of Burma, he says, they have mortuary rituals in which they carry the bones of dead men around their chests. That's the connection. And we looked at each other, and we didn't know whether he was being serious, or there was something deep that we hadn't perceived. But he was most bizarre. He worked on free association. I went to Heifer's one day. They used to sell off, not a second-hand book, but second-hand off-prints. And I picked up some, bought them. I noticed two. One was on the lineage system in Polynesia, and another was on the ancient city of Kano in West Africa. And believe it or not, about 2 weeks later, Rayo asked me to write an article relating those two themes. He'd seen the two pamphlets together, and they clicked somehow in his mind. There's no relationship between them. But in a bizarre way, he of course had some very powerful insights. One never knew whether he was being serious or crazy, or was just thinking beyond one. But he was quite interesting. Then Jones, G.I. Jones, came from West Africa, really pedestrian, ex-government colonial official, but very good on land tenure, and that was his thing. Land tenure was the Igbo. So I had a twice experienced at Cambridge a diseducation. The English department that I'd been in 1942, my tutor, H.S. Bennett at Emmanuel, told me not to go to the lectures by Leavis. He wrote very good social histories of Chaucer's time. Excellent.
And the manner, and medieval manner and so on. Yeah.
Nothing about it, literature in them.
No.
I mean...
A bit of pastel letters, that's all.
Pastel letters. Yes, basically social history. Told me not to go to Leavis, of course I went. But it worked with most people, because Leavis would get about 6 people. After the war, it was packed out. But the English literature was pretty dreary in the extreme. It was also arbitrary. The curriculum was very much Cambridge. It was what people wanted to talk about. So if I think it was perfectly possible to miss out huge slabs of major writings, authors, themes, and epochs. If somebody wanted to talk about second-rate medieval poets, because that's what they were doing at the time. Bad English literature, bad anthropology, and though I loved Cambridge, it was extremely wonderful ferment, stimulus, and one's colleagues, of course, one's fellow students.
Who were the students there with you? Can you remember? You mentioned Jack Biddy.
Yes, I mean anthropology. Oh yes, Jack was a contemporary of mine, and Frank Girling. Now both of them I never got to know extremely well. Frank I did know because he also was in the Communist Party, and Frank had fought in the International Brigade in Spain. So I got to know him well. In fact, he and Ramkrishna Mukherjee and I did a culling of what there was in the classic Marxist text that might be of any use for anthropology. We all were given assignments and we did this. But I never got to know them personally very well because they were married, Jack and Frank, and therefore they lived with their wives in some remote part of Cambridge, not in the college, and they got off.
Garlic Row, I think.
Is that it? Got off to take care of the kids and do the cooking or whatever they should have done. So, and also Kathleen Goff. She was about, I think, got a year or two ahead of me. Exceedingly, everyone adored her. She was so beautiful and intelligent. She'd romped through to her first. She was doing research. She was an absolute role model for perfection. But I didn't, you know, what it's like at school. The gap between 1 year and another is enormous. And 2 years is very big. So I never got to know Kathleen very well. The others, none of them became anthropologists, I don't think, if I can recall.
Godfrey Leonhardt wasn't, he was a teacher, was he, rather than a student at that time? Because I thought Jack and Godfrey were...
I did get to know Godfrey. I think he'd gone to Oxford by this time. I think so, yes. EP used to come over. That was the only ray of light. EP came over and he gave a course for colonial officers, which we were allowed to sit in. And it was marvellous. It was African political systems. And the second wonderful course was given by somebody outside anthropology altogether. That's H.A.R. Gibb on Islam, which was wonderful. A fine scholar. And I learned an awful lot from that. In fact, I learned most of what I know about Islam from Gibb.
Though he's very criticised by Edward Said in his...
I'm sure, as an Orientalist.
Yes.
Nevertheless, he told us what we knew nothing about. He opened up that culture. And I got to know something about the hidden imam and the different orders of Islam and so on, which is very important.
Who were the archaeologists? Was this time?
There was this man, Graham Clark,
Yes.
who writes, I think, very interestingly and in a popular way, but his lectures were really in the extreme. And I think it was he who'd just come from, he'd been in the 8th Army in Libya and had done some excavation out there, and he used to go on about these wretched sherds out in Libya for hours on end. I'm very anti-archaeology. I mean, I have a low threshold of tolerance for potsherds and stones, but all look pretty much the same. It can be made extremely interesting in its wide sweep, like Gordon Child, or indeed Graham Clark and Jack and others. Glyn Daniel was one of them, and at the hands of them, it was splendid. Glyn was my tutor for quite a long time.
Was he? What about Jack Trevor?
Jack was my first tutor, and I got on very well with him, and of course he did know some social anthropology, and so did Glyn. They were quite competent tutors. Nevertheless, they're not social anthropologists by a long chalk, and again, you know, it wasn't a very, very effective teaching. And after a while, too, I resent bitterly this arrogant upper-class Cambridge elitist assumption that Cambridge and Oxford are the centre of the world. Much as I loved being there, I don't think it is the centre of the world. My practical experience was that I had two lousy diseducations in two disciplines, and it would be a very good place to leave. And I don't believe that the world is populated and divided between intelligent people in Cambridge and barbarians outside. So I left. A friend of mine spotted for me in the New Statesman an advert for a new thing called the Groundnut scheme. And I went up there and helped Britain lose £36 million.
236 million?
36. That's the title of a pamphlet that was written by the pseudonym Elijah Wilkes at the time. So I know a lot about aid programs and development programs. As I started in that, I had to go to an interview at Unilever House. The whole scheme was run by Unilever for the Labour government. And the rationale was that there was going to be a world fat shortage, margarine and soap and so forth. So it was a rapid-fire scheme to produce groundnut. And of course they had high-powered scientists, all the latest high-tech stuff, which was they used cut-down Sherman tanks, for example, to pull down the bush in Africa with the great big chains. I was hired, went for a selection interview at Unilever House with 40 other people to become a teacher. The job was to teach basic English, because the Groundnut scheme, being under a Labour government, and particularly Strachey, who had been a great left, though he ended up otherwise, thought that they couldn't reproduce the standard colonial enterprise, but it should do something for the Africans. So they were to be given decent housing, good health care, and education. And they were to be taught particularly English, and I was hired to teach English, but a special form of English, which was a modification of the I.A. Richards basic English that had been worked with used in the Indian Army by a man called Adolph Myers, who subsequently went to Washington. And we went out to Tanzania, it was Tanganyika then, south of Iringa, to Ifunda, which was a technical training centre. The Africans were to be trained as mechanics, not hewers of wood and drawers of water, but skilled mechanics, and they were. That was the project. First, when the Groundnut scheme went downhill, it went downhill because we had very good scientists called Lord Rothschild and other people who did experiments, as scientists should, with the equipment that was to be used in East Africa for farming, in Berkshire or somewhere. But unfortunately, the ploughshares that were used in Berkshire, the soil in Berkshire is not the same as the soil around Kongwa, near Dodoma, which is full of carborundum. And within a very few weeks, all this damned equipment was out of action. Huge parks full of it. Useless, high-tech stuff from the Western world. So the first year, there were some other problems. Kongwa it's a very arid zone around Dodoma, semi-arid. The Gogo, who inhabit that region, are semi-pastoralists with some gardens in the lee of the hills, low hills, because they knew that was the only place where, with any reliability, rain would fall. Not out in the plains, where it very rarely could be assured. And in 2 successive years, as far as the human eye could see, 15 miles of peanuts burned up to a cinder and lost, as I said, £36 million. They actually imported, they did run some Potemkin villages, because when Strachey arrived as food minister, they imported from South Africa sacks of groundnuts, which were exhibited as the products of Congo, which they were not. Filmed and shown on the British, I didn't have television then, on the British movie screens. It was a farce. There was a kind of social program run by a clergyman, I think an ex-bishop, at Kongwa, but we were teaching, and we found very rapidly this social program was the first thing to be abandoned, including our language teaching of English to the Africans. You see, teaching English to the Africans would have opened the whole world to them. They could read anything. So what did we end up doing? I wrote a basic Swahili program for the white engineers who had been brought into the Groundnut scheme to teach Africans to be mechanics and tractor drivers. So we reproduced the colonial business using, equipping these whites to control African labour. That's what it was. I was also visited by 2 extra members of my class from the CID. I subsequently found out years later, who had been sent down to see what Worsley was teaching these Africans, and they reported that I was teaching Swahili. So that was all right. Had I not been, I'd probably have been thrown out of the country. They used to open my mail regularly whenever I got a copy of any of my left-wing literature. It had all been found open in post, sort of pulverised. They have special machines that do it, and stick them down again. So, whereas the real scandals, rogues, and like the man who had been the head of the Ifunda Technical College, a training centre, was found guilty of embezzlement by the same CID people, fired, and within several weeks was the manager of a gold mine in Kenya. So if you're a politico, there's one law, and if you're a racketeer, there's another. So the first thing to be scrubbed from the Groundnut scheme, cut, was the entirety of our program. I mean, that's just superfluous nonsense, all that social program. So I went home. No job, no money. My contract terminated a year or so before it should have. Well, I did have money. We were quite well paid.
How old were you by this time? You were 46, this was.
46, 22.
Still really young, yes.
Oh yeah. I had my 18th birthday in Nairobi, a night of V-Day, I think. And
so you arrived home penniless on the streets of...
Yes, no, but while I'd been in East Africa on the Groundnut scheme, well, I still wanted to be an anthropologist. Now, there was no anthropology in Tanganyika. There was nothing in Kenya. Nothing at the time. I find it very difficult now when I meet Kamba sociologists in Milwaukee. I can't believe it. The only Kamba and Kikuyu I ever knew were peasants. However, I've got used to it now. There was nothing, but I wrote to the Rhodes Livingstone Institute, remembering those dirty books from Hutton's day, and said, if you ever have any posts, or I really would be interested in applying. Never heard anything, of of course, communications being what they were in Africa. Then at the end of the scheme, or somewhere during the scheme, we all went on holiday. A group of us took a clapped out old wagon, which we bought collectively, and went down to South Africa through northern Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, to Johannesburg, where I met Ruth first. So being a good communist,
I wondered why you'd dedicated your last book.
I was wildly in love with her.
Yeah.
Apart from her wonderful life. I saw the film about her life the other day and was very moved. A very good film. We went down there, so I saw South Africa. It's the only time I've ever been there, and it was really quite mild then. I remember coming back from a Communist Party meeting one night through the streets of central Johannesburg with Ruth and an Indian and an African and some other people being jeered at by what we would now call louts, Afrikaans-speaking louts, because we were simply together in the street, in public. Although it was a very peculiar Communist Party meeting, because it was a guy called Yanni du Plessis, I remember, was trying to stimulate these loyal communists to be more aggressively anti the system. Apparently they were not very, not militant enough for him. So then we went back to Tanganyika and then home. And as a result, I also called in at Johannesburg to see another ex-DC who was the head of the department at Wits. I've forgotten his name now. He'd worked down in southern Tanganyika as a district commissioner, provincial commissioner, I think. There was nothing doing down there.
An anthropologist, was this? An anthropology department of sorts.
Yes, there's an anthropology department of sorts. There was a good one at Cape Town where Monica Hunter had been, Wilson had been. And so I went back home and I was called for an interview to the Colonial Office for a post. I think they'd gotten my name somehow through the Rhodes Livingston Institute application. I can't quite recall now. Anyhow, I was called for an interview. Max Gluckman was one of the assessors and a Colonial Office official. And they said that the job was going to be a study of race relations in Rhodesia. What was my attitude towards race relations in Rhodesia? So I said, I'm against it, morally, philosophically, intellectually, etc. And I explained why. So rather surprisingly, at the end of the interview, Max said, well, you didn't get it. But maybe we'll keep in touch and good luck and all that kind of thing. Well, in fact, in about a week or two later, I got a letter from him saying he'd been appointed to a new chair at Manchester University and would I care to put in for a research assistantship. I did, and I got it. On the basis, I hadn't explained, that when I was sitting in the Funda, in the Groundnut scheme, I wanted to try and do some amateur anthropology, and I used to go out at weekends to the villages roundabout. Well, what can you do at a weekend, you know? So, what I did do was write a grammar of Hehe, language spoken around there. Again, knowing no linguistics, but I taught myself, and there was an American with us who was a linguist, employed on this same teaching unit. So I did write a grammar of Hehe, and I was quite proud of it, and I did a lot of wire recordings of oral literature and music.
What is a wire recorder?
Wire recorder was the ancestor of the tape recorder. It was literally very thin wires, which had the unfortunate habit of coming off the reel and festooning all over the place in a most dreadful tangle. Sort of soft leadish material. Thank God they were superseded technologically. But when I went to Manchester, I was going to do an MA on Gihaya language. And after about 4 or 5 months working on it, he made me do some courses in Bantu language, linguistics for the other postgraduates. Vic Turner was one, Ronnie Frankenberg later, Freddie Bailey, a list of the great and the good. And so I did that. And he said to me one day, look, he said, if you're going to stay around here or be an anthropologist, you better become an anthropologist and not a linguist. So I said, all right then. So he said, unfortunately, he said, you've got one great defect. I said, what's that? He said, you were not trained at Cambridge. So you don't know any anthropology. And I was hurt. I was shocked to be told I didn't know any anthropology. And Jack Trevor had told me I would have got starred first. It was absolutely correct. I didn't. What he meant is I'd never read Miles Fortis or Evans Pritchard. I had read the Noah.
What do you mean when you said you weren't trained at Cambridge? You were trained at?
he meant I'd had a very poor anthropological education.
I see.
Correct, perfectly correct. I'd read the Yazandi too, but I don't know whether I understood it. So I remember going off, and he said, read Fortis, Silensis. So I did. I went off to Manchester City Library, isolated myself, and I read through that full stop by full stop. And as I went through, being a Marxist, it quips, it's an alternative view of the world, a counter-ideology, if you like. I couldn't buy this approach of Mayer's, and I started taking very detailed notes to try. I couldn't see. I was a reductionist Marxist. I was a primitive Marxist. I suppose I was an economic determinist. I hate to think of it now, but so I went through taking very careful notes about just how the hell did these people actually make a living, their farming practices and so on. How did it relate to the lineage structure, and how did that relate to their ideological structures of the Talis and the Namos? And that's how I came to write the critique of Meyer, which won me the Curl Prize at the Royal Anthropological Institute. I don't agree with it now, just as I don't agree actually with the trumpet will sound, shall sound, because I think it was reductionist, and
does that mean you agree with Meyer, or do you
I think I agree.
or agree more
Well,
with Meyer?
no, Meyer's an idealist. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, the kinship system doesn't function as a kind of externalization of structural principles. It works because structural principles are built into a systematic sets of relations which are institutionalized in society, not just economic ones. But I think his approach in the end is mystical or quasi-mystical. But perhaps I could illustrate it much better, I think, with reference to the trumpet, which I came to write eventually. Although there's a lot of biography to go in first.
Let's leave it till then.
Should we leave it till then,
Yes.
right?
Mm.
So,
You were sitting in the library reading Meyer Fortes.
I was sitting in the library reading Meyer Fortes, and I thought, this is wrong. There's something fundamentally wrong about this whole approach, and I'm going to try and tease out what it is. And life was luxurious in those days. It wasn't like the ESRC whipping people to finish their theses in 2 years. You could actually have time to sit and think and do some serious work. And I think I sat there for 6 weeks in the Manchester Central Ref trying to figure out what was wrong with Meyer. And I turned it into an MA dissertation. I'm just trying to think. And that was the point at which I submitted. Max suggested he rather liked it. I submitted for the Curl Bequest Essay Prize, the Royal Anthropological Institute. I did, and I got it. Went down to London, and I had never met Meyer Fortes, and he was pleasant. And he said, I don't agree with this. He introduced me the awards ritual. I don't agree with Worsley's line of criticism, of course. However, let us agree to differ. And I made a few equally polite remarks, and it was a ritual occasion, and I got my prize. And after that I had the most positive relations with Meyer because he was a generous person. And we never really discussed Talency again. And I did subsequently apply to his department. He once told me that he'd very much like to have had me, but Jack got the job. No goody, because he was a sort of in-house Prince Regent or whatever. Line of succession and rather natural, and a West Africanist and so forth. So I stayed with Max and then applied again to the Rhodes Lymington Institute. And this time I got it. I was appointed to a research post in the Institute. But like the Bourbons, some people never remember anything and they never forget anything, and one of those is MI5. They stopped me getting the post. I was turned down on what was said to me. I've forgotten the exact phrasing now, and I think it was all verbal. I was given the post, but it was snatched back on intelligence reports. So I was doomed. After having worked on Africa from 1943 to about 1949, now 6 years, I was an Africanist through and through, besotted with Africa. It was the end of the road.
But at what level I suppose the Rhodes Lymington Institute was funded by the government, and that's how they could directly have it.
Well, there's quite a lot of literature on it now in the journal Africa by this chap Brown, who's on the history of the Rhodes Lymington Institute, which details the political interference by trustees and by political authorities.
We have all the papers in our basement. John
Do you?
Barnes left copies of all the letters and everything by chance. So.
Well, see, Max himself was under a cloud. I mean, after all, a man who writes the research program for the Worsley Institute and calls it a 3-year plan or 5-year plan is asking for trouble, and says positive things about the USSR and its planning system. And his wife, Max, was never a red. He was good anti-colonial, radical liberal, I should think. Mary, his wife, of course, was a member of the South African Communist Party, and much of their joint persona, as it were, was perceived as being Max's doing, but much of the political orientation was, in fact, Mary, who has always been an activist and has ended up significantly working for a trade union. Now she's widowed. But Max was a fine anti-colonial. His hour of glory was when he took on Sir Philip Mitchell, then the governor of East Africa, over the Mau Mau. And Max had the courage to defend the Mau Mau. Well, at that time, the Kenyan settlers were having photographic exhibitions of dismembered corpses in the House of Commons and telling everybody the stories, which were probably true, about how part of the Mau Mau ritual was the drinking of menstrual blood. Things which absolutely alienated the British public from the Mau Mau movement, which was, the leader to darkness and death, is what Mitchell described Kenyatta as, though Kenyatta had nothing to do with the Mau Mau. Max defended it, an act of supreme courage, and later it became one of his radio talk programs, which became, I think they were the number 3 top radio programs after Tommy Handley's Take It From Here, and a few other extremely popular things. So can you believe it? Anthropology on the 3rd program. Max and I and Tom Boyer and other people and some very fine Quaker woman called Eileen Fletcher, who exposed the tortures that had been going on in the camps, went around various platforms in England, and I came in contact through that with the Movement for Colonial Freedom. Joseph Murumbi ran a rundown office just outside King's Cross down there. Later Foreign Minister of Kenya. I met him on an aeroplane years later. So I was very actively involved in the anti-colonial movement. Well, it was all to my undoing. They blocked me going to Africa. I could see it. So Max said, that's the end of the road. Why don't you better go to Australia?
Who told you that you were blocked? And
I think Max did.
He said, we have verbal reports.
Something like that. I have nothing on paper, and I don't keep records much anyhow. He said, go to Australia. Nardell's just been appointed the chair at Canberra, and you can apply for a research scholarship. I did. Firth interviewed me in London on behalf of the university. He was the dean of the new university, and I got it. Me and Ken Burridge, who also did a cargo book, as you will know, several. I went out there, and as Sheila and I were on the ship, one went on ships in those days, entered the Great Australian Bight near Adelaide. News came over the radio that Menzies was having a referendum on the outlawing of the Communist Party. So we looked at each other and thought, this is going to be a very warm landing. And we landed, and much to Menzies' surprise, and much to the surprise of political scientist researchers into the matter that I met later at ANU, it was decisively rejected. Wonderful victory for democracy. So that was the end of the attempt to legally outlaw the Communist Party. Now, that wasn't the end of their attempts to get rid of communists and all their doings, however, legally or illegally. So then I was planning to go, with Nardell's approval, to the Central Highlands of New Guinea. And I read up all the literature. And part of that process, I read all the district commission, not what they call patrol officers' reports in the Department of, I don't know what they called it, Overseas Department, which is a kind of colonial office, which was run by a very strange man called Freddie Rose, who is at present retired Professor Emeritus at the Humboldt University in East Berlin. Fred was English, but lived most of his life in Australia, trained as a meteorologist, and had done a diploma in anthropology at Cambridge before the war. Went out, and to get near Aborigines, which is what he wanted like me, to be an anthropologist, he went up to Groote Eylandt. in the Gulf of Carpentaria, where there was a seaplane base on the route, Sunderland flying machines, from England to Sydney. It used to stop off and refuel and feed the passengers at Groot Island, and the huge base is still there. Fred did his meteorology. What he really did was the kinship system of the Aboriginal tribe that were around there. And then he became an officer in the Australian administration, and he was the one I met. When I met him, was with the Communist Party, of course. But he helped me find these reports, and I read them all. And then, these are bad times. I've just written an article about this as a festschrift for Stanley Diamond called The Politics of Doing... It's really about doing anthropology under McCarthy. As Americans always think McCarthy only happened in America. It didn't. It happened everywhere around the world.
What date are we talking about?
We're talking
50?
about 1950. 50, it was awful. When Sheila was having a baby in the Canberra Community Hospital, I walked home that night and I rang through the hospital on the way back. It was a long walk. Said, "Has the baby arrived yet?" She said, "No." But she said, "Have you heard the news?" She said, they're going to arrest all the commies. The nurse told me this. So I thought, oh, this is not like give Sheila an easy birth, this. Went home, and there was my friend Bob Gollan, who later a distinguished historian, digging a hole in the garden and burying Communist Party literature. But we all expected to be in jail next morning. Now, I can't remember exactly at what point it was. I think what provoked that was the defection of a Soviet diplomat called Vladimir Petrov, who was a spy for the Soviet Union. About a week before that, I had got very interested in New Guinea, of course, and I discovered that the first European ever to arrive in New Guinea was, in fact, a Russian, Macfarlane. And I read everything I could find, which wasn't much, but I knew I had taught myself Russian, being a communist. I used to learn it on the bus going in and out of Manchester. I couldn't understand. I knew about who Tolstoy was, and I knew Dostoevsky and all that. I couldn't understand this guy Podgovorka, who seemed to have very pithy sayings about everything, rather like La Rochefoucauld. You know, a Rolling Stone gathers no moss and all this sort of thing. I discovered it meant later proverb. So I learned Russian, and therefore I could read Sovietskaya Ethnografia, which is an awful journal. And however, I read it. And I did establish some connections with Soviet anthropologists like Potiekin, the grand old Africanist. In fact, I think it was Ronnie Frankenberg and I went down to London to meet him. He came on a visit once. He was later poisoned by, it is generally believed, the Portuguese secret police when he was on a visit to Tanzania. Died. He was a ghastly old Stalinist, but I remember asking him the most naive, bourgeois, Western liberal, although I was a communist formerly, of the attitudes of my background. I said, how did a peasant son from the Ukraine become an anthropologist specializing in Africa? And he looked at me with unbelief, disbelief, and said, the party sent me. So that was how Potiekin became an Africanist. So I could read Russian, read Sovietskaya Ethnografia, and I knew that there were some writings of Macfarlane about New Guinea that were not published. So I went to the Soviet embassy and spoke to the cultural attaché, and he got some things for me. Karkovits, his name was. This is about a week before the Petrov trial broke. And when the trial broke, I thought, my God, I've just been up in the Soviet embassy. They must have been filming all people that come in and out. I'll be in jail in no time. Well, I wasn't. Freddie went up on trial. They had it was the most illustrious trial. Freddie Rose, the anthropologist, colonial official, administrative official. Freddie was put on the box. It was the most distinguished trial. It was a trial, honoured to be amongst them. It was a royal commission of inquiry into espionage. All distinguished, I would say everybody from the sort of slightly right of centre to the left were up there. Colin Simpson, who wrote a book about called Adam and Ochre and so on. He was put up. They were all put up there. Nothing was ever proved about anybody. Freddie was, because they weren't spies. Freddie wasn't a spy. Ridiculous. What could they spy anyhow? Well, I had great admiration for those Australian communists. Lovely people. Some of them war heroes. I remember Bob Michel, for example, got an American Silver Star were fighting with the Hooks in the Philippines, and told me that he'd been fighting with the princess. And years later I met this princess. He'd been fighting with the princess and with William Pomeroy, Bill Pomeroy. I met them both. And she was indeed of royal descent, of aristocratic descent from one of these peoples, I don't know who. And, so they were splendid people, but we were living underground. And I have no apology for later, when I was in fact in trouble politically, it did break over my head. I would not admit that I was a communist. Now I didn't see why one should. Firstly, because of all the illicit tactics they were using against us. Secondly, because of the habeas corpus principle. If they've got any case to level against me that is based on a legal offence, let them put me up in court and try and prove it. We don't. We have the principle of the secret ballot. Similarly, we don't ask what your politics are. We have a belief in the right to privacy in certain matters, including politics, and I exercised that. In any case, I didn't believe in cutting my own throat. So I refused to make any statement, and it was a great principle in the McCarthy era in the United States not to make a statement. That was one thing one was supposed to do, not to accept this invasion of political rights. So we wouldn't do it. However, after the Petrov trial passed by and the farce of it, Freddie was fired, went off farming in Tasmania, and eventually he was married to a German woman, Edith, and through that they ended up eventually in East Berlin, and Freddie became professor of anthropology, and later wrote the most exhaustive and methodologically extraordinary study of a kinship system of the Ndlyagwa, which has got a matrix. It couldn't be printed in a capitalist society because the cost would be too big. There are about 100 pages of terms of identification by every Aborigine units for every other single person in the tribe of 450 people. The whole thing is on matrices at the end of the book. And Freddie's book is, has been said by Worsley and de Jong at Leiden, is in some ways a historic landmark in Australian studies. So he was no slouch, Freddie. He was a great expert on the pastoral industry in the Northern Territory and all other things he turned his hand to. But after the trial passed by, then came the axe. I was ready to go to I'd been down to Sydney. Sheila and I had spent a lot of money, ANU provided scholars with, on food for a year and all equipment for field research in the Highlands. I was going to work nearby where Mick Reed had worked. We'd been down to Hordens, ordered all this stuff, it was crated, it was going onto the ship. And so the day before, I had the last thing to do, I went into the External Affairs Department, that's what it was called. I said, please can I have my entry permit for New Guinea? They said, no, not you. So I thought, oh my God, it's the second time. I've been thrown out of Africa, now I'm thrown out of New Guinea, it's the end now, I can't become an anthropologist. However, as they're saying, we were discussing earlier, you know, about the French have, about these wild animals, they're wicked animals. Les animaux sont méchants, ils se défendent. Wild animals, they defend themselves, wicked creatures that they are. I thought, to hell, I'm not going to be pushed around by these people. I decided if I'm ruined, my career as an anthropologist is not possible, because you couldn't become an anthropologist without doing field work, of course. Then I'll pull the temple down with me like Sansom. And I went public, and my God, all hell broke loose. I was on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. The House of Representatives debated me. Harold Holt, the Internal Affairs Minister, Hasluck, would theoretically wrote one of the first books on Australian Aborigines, and quite a good book, a very conservative man. They all attacked me as a dangerous red. And
when you say you went public, you wrote to the paper saying that I've been refused permission.
I think I did. I can't even remember the sequence of events, but I let it be. I went, and luckily I practiced some democracy. I and a number of other students had set up an Australian National University Students' Association only a few weeks beforehand. We were only a handful of research students, and all of us joined, about 10 or something. And it took up my case. and took it to all the other universities in Australia, and of course it was quite a large scale Australian National Union of Students. That's, I think, how it became public. And it was pretty hellish. I don't know if you've ever been hounded by the paparazzi. I never want to go through it again, but they would almost lie underneath the bed. Nearly drove Sheila around the bend. It was miserable. I couldn't tap your phone, but they were on the phone all the time, outside the front door. She was in a bad way with it.